Hey Ding Dongs, I'm Jamie.
I'm Richard.
And this is Explain It to Jamie, the political comedy podcast in which I, Jamie, a politically innocent but curious young man, have the complicated political happenings of the world explained to me by my friend Richard.
Jamie's eating a wrap. He's eating a wrap and he just almost died. I saw it happen.
I hit the K sound in curious, and a piece of wrap almost flew out of my mouth into the computer, and I saved the day. I don't like to throw around the word hero too often, but
you saved your own day. You were your own hero.
This is an instance in which I would use the word hero. So those of you that are listening to this, so this week we're trying something different. Richard is away.
I'm in New York City for the month, and so we have to record over Skype now. So this might be a bit of a different vibe for us.
That's
so
right.
Be patient with us as we navigate this exciting new area of technical expertise.
Yeah, and we figured, hey, because this is Canada's 150 yesterday, and because we're navigating this potentially disastrous new technical clusterfuck, why don't we invite 4 other people into this conversation
to just take a bunch of the grenades for us.
Yeah, exactly. Just let's hook as many computers up to this shit hurricane as we possibly can.
Yeah, that's right. So we're very pleased to welcome back friends of the show and former guests, Hunter Cardinal, Thomas McKechnie, and Anthony MacMahon to riff on Canada's 150 with us. So why don't you guys furnish forth your voices?
Hello.
Who are you?
I'm Hunter.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Thomas.
Yeah.
And hey, I'm Anthony.
Yeah.
We did it, guys. We got through the intros.
Yeah. Thomas and Anthony are all remote, but Hunter and I are in the same room. So if you're like trying to play, who's in what room at home.
There you
go.
If you're like, wow, Richard and Hunter have pretty amazing chemistry. They don't.
Yeah, what happened?
They don't have it.
Yeah, what we do have is a zero ping situation. Okay, so Canada turned, it's the 150. It was the 150th anniversary of that time that Confederation came into effect.
Yes. Well, maybe we should start things off by saying we understand we've covered 150 in our Explain It to Jamie episodes, and this we just thought would be a nice debrief, a way of talking about what personally each of our 150s has been, what we did, how we celebrated, if we celebrated, what we did effectively. And these are all, as you know, because you're avid listeners, previous guests on the show. So we thought we would this would be nice.
Yeah, that's right.
And also be nice.
Because I've been really busy in New York this week, I didn't have time to research a different thing, so sorry.
Yeah.
So what did you do, Jamie? Did you get up to anything for Canada's big day?
Not a whole lot. I worked out. I did
just like George Brown would have wanted you to.
Yeah, just like I worked out. I had a 2-show day, so I was doing. We did. And for those of you that don't know, I'm doing a show called by a company called Video Cabaret down at the Soul Pepper Space in the Distillery District here in Toronto. Shameless plug. It's the story of Confederation, actually. So it's 4 hours of a very stylized, grotesque, hilarious take on the founding of Canada and some of the not so great events that followed thereafter, but it's educational, hilarious, and interesting. I did that all day yesterday, 4 hours. So
nice. That must have been kind of like a popular event. I bet people were there. I bet it was.
Yeah, it was pretty good. Pretty good. Yeah. Afternoon show sold the fuck out, and evening show, I think we had a couple seats still available because it intertwined with the fireworks. So we were pretty stoked to get the audience we had. But it was actually a real neat way to spend the Canada Day because you got to just live the history of it on the day, 150 years later.
That's cool. Thomas, what did you get up to, man?
I guess appropriately enough, I moved. I did not forcibly evict a bunch of people from the house that I moved to, which would have been the more complete metaphor for an appropriate Canada Day celebration. But I just moved and assembled an IKEA futon and unpacked some boxes and played a farming simulator. All in
This is
various
very
ways, really,
appropriate. Very
right? Really,
appropriate.
everything all ties in very well.
Is it true, and Tony, you can maybe shade some light on this. I think it's true that July 1st is the day that almost all leases in Quebec roll over, so everyone in Montreal moves on July 1st. Is that true?
That's 100% true. That's like an old.
Yeah.
It was an old law that only got turned over maybe like 30 years ago, so all leases still expire, and they just celebrate their national holiday a week before Canada Day, right? So.
That's right. So it's like on the actual Canada Day, they're like, fuck you, you Anglos. Like, I celebrate your day by hitting another U-Haul with my U-Haul.
Because
I've heard it's a real bonanza for like finding furniture on the street. Like it's just like the whole city turns into a massive flea market because everyone is moving and everyone is leaving their crap on the front on their front lawn.
yeah.
Wow.
It's just funny that like Quebec institutionalized the idea that Canada Day is an extremely annoying day that's like full of extremely difficult chores.
Yeah.
Tony, what did you get up to, man?
I think I had the most stereotypical Canada Day. We sat on the roof drinking beer and getting rained out and not doing anything exciting at all. With friends,
Anyone watch the fireworks?
No.
No, I didn't see him.
I was hanging out with somebody in a basement.
What a cool group of guys.
I saw a video of the fireworks.
Fucking nothing.
Hunter and I are right in New York, and we're part of like a show that's several shows, a festival that's of Canadian artists who are toured down here.
Right, so I bet like the whole city was probably partying, eh?
Yeah, that's right. People were.
There were fireworks, but I couldn't tell.
Yeah, there apparently were fireworks.
I was like, surely it's not for Canada Day.
It was drowned out by the shooting that was 2 blocks over. So, actually,
No, I think
at the
Americans
Empire
just,
State
like-
Building,
I think Americans just like launch fireworks for like the week before and the week after July 4th. Like it's just one
Yeah,
long
right.
pyrotechnic
Yeah.
display.
Yeah, that's right. There's some accidental Canada Day celebration. The Empire State Building was lit up red and white. That was kind of fun. And yeah, so we were part of this big like festival of theater, which opened last night as kind of in sync with the Canada 150 stuff. So that was what we were doing. We were performing in the theater, singing songs and pretending to be people we not.
Wow.
Yeah.
How do you do it?
And it was a fun night. Certainly, I felt complicated about the whole anniversary thing, but we, the Consul General of Canada in New York spoke at our thing, and there was like a lot of Canadian people. Kind of, we absorbed a lot of Canadian people who were in New York, so there were a lot of Canadians there, which was kind of nice.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's a pretty smart idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It seemed kind of like a pretty chill affair, to be honest. I mean, like from what I saw of the celebrations across the country, it didn't seem like anything particularly unusually insane was happening. Like in terms of the celebrations, we'll talk about the protests, which certainly are kind of the news story right now from what I've been seeing, which I think is like an entirely appropriate thing.
Yeah.
But like I saw that there was some sort of concert, and then I saw that there was a 20,000 story inflatable duck or some shit. Like that's basically what I know about what happened. Like I think everyone kind of had more or less a more normal Canada Day. Like I don't think it was particularly insane. If you're listening to this and you're not Canadian too, generally what happens on Canada Day is like you go with your family to like some main public place in your city, and there's like some shitty band playing from your town.
Yeah.
And also like the Canadian government buys every town in Canada a cake, so there's this like same cake that you can get if you're in a small town. If you're in a big city, you'll never see it, but like every small town in Canada gets like a cake. It's a real thing.
Yeah. But this Canada Day, unlike any other, more time has passed since the signing of Confederation than any other.
Yeah, no other Canada Day works that way.
No.
Usually it's random where we end up, but no, yeah, I mean it's the concept of a big anniversary is kind of a weird thing, and it seems like I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised by the discourse I saw around it. Like it seemed like very few people in my network, including the more like out there people I know, were. It seemed like very few people could mention us celebrating this anniversary without also mentioning the fact that we fuck over our Indigenous people a huge amount to make this country and are continuing to fuck them over into the present day. And I think that that's a step in the correct direction for us reflecting on our country. How do you guys encounter this or like deal with the process?
Yeah, I don't know if it's just because
you haven't talked yet. I kind of talked for you.
No. My favorite thing is just hearing the discourse change to, so wait, why are we celebrating 150? And just like really earnestly, looking at the 150 years of ongoing colonization, and actually being able to be like, is that something we should be proud of and celebrating? Like, what are we celebrating? Let's just look at, what we're talking about and make sure that we're naming things properly. And that for me is really exciting, especially, hearing that more and more from different types of friends, like not just like really socially angry and politically angry friends that I tend to gravitate towards, but like just people who are just chill, So that's always exciting.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about on that note was, and I don't know how this makes it, is that, I and everyone I know grew up in a school that at the very least highlighted the fact, like, it's not like we weren't taught about the indigenous people and how they were treated. You know what I mean? Like, nobody can deny that by sheer ignorance, At least that's what I feel, and that's what I've perceived, is that in most conversations I've entered in, that even if we disagree about certain things about it, at the very least everybody understands that horrible things were done hundreds of years ago and continue to be done.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, I also find, like, I'm really starting to see the tension in, like, Canada's own national narrative of itself, and I mean literally in the sense that, like, in, what was it, 68 or 69, when Pierre Trudeau kind of like enshrined multiculturalism as like a value of Canadian society, and he did it like legislatively, right? Like he wrote it into law, and now it's in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Like, there's like a hard line in the sand in Canadian people's minds based on how old you are. Like, before that point, there was still kind of like, yay, we're British sort of a thing, and after that point now it's like, well, we're not, we're this multicultural country. That's what we grew up with, but we're like, our parents' generation is like, no, we're this like British colony. And even if however much somebody identifies with that thing, that's like what the main narrative was. So there's already like tension kind of in like how into it you can get to be like, yes, Canada's great, Vimy Ridge, like we're so wonderful, and then if there's people in our generation who are like, they don't have any relationship to stuff like Vimy Ridge or being British or whatever. And so already we're all confused, what I mean? About what we're celebrating.
It's funny because in that time, Trudeau was also trying to pass the white paper, which would have like obliterated any form of Indigenous rights, with the main goal of assimilating Indigenous people into Canada's population. So I just find it funny that it's like, hey, we want to be a multicultural country, but don't you dare be Indigenous.
Yeah,
right. Multicultural, but not rights. That culture.
Yeah. Well, because he was a true federalist Canadian, right? Like, he believed in a strong central state that everyone was under the umbrella of, and the idea of Indigenous people having their sovereignty. Like, he didn't really like Quebec's special status either, which is why in Quebec he's a much more complicated figure than he is in a lot of English Canada. Mm-hmm. And I think that certainly in our day, that's not a popular or appropriate even way to engage with the Indigenous situation.
Well, it's interesting because from that point forward, or actually it had existed before, but I just find that there is a false Trudeauian mindset of we're all equal, and we all have the same rights, and a lot of the discourse that I'm reading about and listening to is saying no. Indigenous people have a specific and unique set of rights between the Crown and the various nations that signed and made treaty, and that needs to be upheld and respected, because Canada's like validity as a country and the core of its justice system is through honoring the treaties, and that was in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So like, I'm sorry, that doesn't really apply. But still, people today are like, well, like, why do you guys want more rights? Or like, what about me?
So
or
we
like,
just want the actual rights that you said we had.
yeah,
those are the rights we want.
Remember when we were talking about it, and you stroked the pipe, and we did that special ceremony that made sure that anything that you promised would be upheld forever. We're just kind of keeping tabs and following up on whether or not you're going to actually do that, because if not, then you're kind of not fulfilling the treaties, and therefore Canada kind of can't be a thing. So if you want, that would be sick.
Yeah.
To say nothing of the land that isn't treaty land that was never ceded.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's super on everybody's minds. And certainly, like, with the big protest at Parliament Hill, that's kind of the main news story that I've been seeing. And again, I don't think it's a bad thing. Like, and I'm glad it was a peaceful protest. For those who don't know, there was a Indigenous activists the day before Canada Day on June 30th started, like, erecting this huge teepee on Parliament Hill, which then the police tried to shut down, and there was a lot of confrontation between them, and eventually they were allowed to raise it, and Justin Trudeau cosplaying as Bruce Springsteen came down to go talk to them or something. Like, if you guys see the outfit he was wearing, it's really weird. Yeah.
He was wearing his cool guy. Like, I always love that when I can see footage of Justin Trudeau and I know that he knows he looks good. You know what I mean?
100%.
Like, I've watched his vanity, like, slowly go up incrementally, like, through his prime ministership as people... Like, I think as it would anybody who the whole world is like, you're so sexy and so beautiful. Like, look at every fucking celebrity in the world, how nuts they turn out. But, like, yeah, I love it when I can see Justin Trudeau falling to that same sense of vanity.
Yeah, totally.
Here's maybe a screwball question with regard to discourse and stuff, because the most common frustration I hear from people who aren't connected to the plight of the Aboriginal person is that, like, well, it wasn't us, you know, and let me finish this thought before you guys jump in and answer. So I was talking to someone the other day that said, why does Hitler get brought up so often as an example of, like, absolute evil? Like, Joseph Stalin was way worse. There have been other dictators who have been way, way worse. And my point was, well, because we know people that suited up and went across the ocean to kill Hitler. So, like, of course, stories of that are going to be stronger and more easily recalled than stories of people going to fight Joseph Stalin. They're just more people who actually experienced the world in which he was affecting. So use that as an example, and that's back to my original point. That's the argument I hear. Not so much an argument as it is and I understand. I go, yeah, you were born in Kingston, Ontario. You went to school, you tried your hardest your whole life, and now you're just trying to make your way in the world. And there's these people who are unhappy with the way the country is being run. As far as you know, has been running smoothly. I can understand how someone's realism could be interrupted by that, and how that could be frustrating, especially if they're not even engaged in it. I'm not saying that's correct. I'm just trying to represent a conversation I've heard. And I don't necessarily agree with, but I also don't know that I myself am articulated enough to have a clear conversation regarding. You know what I mean?
Yeah, man, I get it. I psychologically understand why people want what this argument is.
Yeah. Add a fun little tidbit on the end of that I forgot to say is, like, I am aware, back to the Hitler thing, that, like, my grandkids aren't going to know who Hitler was as clearly as I know who Hitler is because of my proximity to it.
What's crazy is, like, your grandkids, think about this. This is going to fuck your mind. Your grandkids are going to know about, like, who Hitler was the way that you know who, like, Napoleon was.
Exactly.
Or, like, Abe Lincoln.
Exactly. And I am anticipating people in our generation defending, like, you know, being like, how can the kids these days not know who Hitler was when he was so fucking important? When it's like, yes, but he was important to us. You know, he was and this is coming off wrong. I don't mean to say Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal problems aren't important to us now. I'm not saying that. But that's the same. You know what I mean? The same line of conversation, I feel.
Yeah, I think it loops back around to, you remember we talk a little bit sometimes about we mentioned on the podcast once this book by this guy named K Punk who writes about capitalism, and who wrote basically like capitalism has become so ingrained that it's impossible to even conceive of the end of capitalism. And there's this kind of like very mainstream reaction that people have to stuff like this, where they're like, well, it can't be changed, you know, too bad, like maybe back in the day it was bad, but this is how the world is and nothing can be done about it.
Right.
And I think that that's an extremely convenient thing to believe, and also it's like a kind of immoral and irresponsible thing to believe. Just because you don't think you personally colonized anybody, which you're probably wrong about if you really start to unpack how colonialism manifests in the modern day, just because you don't think you're responsible for the genocide of our indigenous people doesn't mean A, that you don't benefit from it, and B, that you're not part of the potential solution for it. You know what I mean?
For
it's
sure.
like for me it's a moral imperative, and a like spiritual imperative for Canada too. I actually truly believe that a huge part of why Canada struggles for identity is because you can't actually learn about Canadian history without confronting the fact that we committed a genocide. And until we come to terms with that, we won't be able to fully embrace our true history. And I look to modern young German people as like a potential example, you know, young Germans who are taught to feel a sense of personal responsibility for the Holocaust, even though they weren't even alive for it. But they're taught, this happened here, it could happen again, and it's part of your responsibility to understand that like your people did this and you need to make sure this doesn't happen again. I think that that's like a just and moral thing to be striving for. Boys?
Can you restate your initial question, James?
It's not so much a question. I'm just trying to represent a point of view that I like. Part of the I understand the impulse, and I try and resist myself, but I don't necessarily have a good argument, which is, what is the threshold of responsibility in history? I agree with Richard in that, like, I speaking to young German people, I enjoy the responsibility they take for the Holocaust on behalf of their country and the past people in their country.
Hey Ding Dongs, Future Richard coming in here from the editing booth. We had a little technical blip with our Skype and we lost some of this recording right now, so all you need to know to jump right back into where we picked back up is that Jamie began lining out a fictional construct of a hypothetical small-town Canadian white person who doesn't have any Indigenous friends or know anyone Indigenous but has a lot of opinions about them. Alright, back to the episode.
They themselves have no real relationship with any Aboriginal people, as far as I can say. At least not that they've never introduced me to their friends who happen to be Aboriginal or anything like that. And so they have a skewed view on their responsibility in it, because they're as far as they know, they've just been living their lives, going about their business. And now there's this sort of this hiccup in their life cycle. I understand the frustration with being like, yeah, but I didn't do anything. I was raised in this town just trying to make my way, and now I'm getting yelled at. And so I get it. I get the frustration. I also think that, yes, we all benefited from colonialism and we should all take responsibility and have a true understanding of our history, and that's the healthy way to move forward. I just don't know how to talk to somebody in that situation. Also, I should just make the caveat, I am no longer really talking about my cousins from Red Deer, Alberta specifically. I'm just using that as an example, just in case they're listening and they're like, hold on.
And this kind of stuff, like the protests we've been seeing, that really brings that opinion out of the woodwork. That one and the "you should be less angry and that will make more people listen to you" argument, right? Like,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like
I would say
go ahead.
That, and maybe this is sort of my maybe this is intellectually lazy on my part, where whenever someone's like, there's a problem, and I was like, I'm going to blame capitalism. But I blame capitalism. In that it's the sort of hyper-individual sort of concept that came out of the Enlightenment of the sort of individual and the individual's rights and the individual's responsibility, that it's your job to look after number one, and it's your job to take care of your people, is really poisonous culturally. Because it means that we don't broaden our locus beyond sort of our direct and immediate concerns, and that we are responsible for we are responsible for the whole world. We're all responsible for each other, and that is very antithetically to the ideology of capitalism. And so it's I don't know if it's any more of a useful thing to say than what you already know, to say like, no, you are actually responsible for these things, and like these things exist because you allow them to exist. But I think that a recognition of a shared responsibility is really, really vital, and that these things all the world that exists because we allow it to exist in the way that it does, and that the process of taking responsibility for the world that you live in is an arduous one, and like all sorts of things become less fun and interesting. Like you watch movies after you start taking responsibility for the world you live in, and you're like, oh, this is horrible. But
I think, and when you say the world that we live in exists because we allow it to exist, I feel like it's important to really color in that image that like so much injustice exists because we simply permit it passively to exist. You know what I mean? It requires activation and activity to undo, and not doing anything. It sort of makes you feel like you're not culpable in furthering injustice, but it actually is the process of allowing that injustice to continue is just simply not doing anything. You know, just living your life, quote unquote, is often what allows terrible things to happen.
Well, there's that.
Anthony, you got any thoughts? Sorry.
Well, there's that great line that a small committed group of people. Do not doubt that a small committed group of people could change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. The sort of flip side of that being like. A small committed group of people can change the world in terrible ways if there are not a group of people, if no one else is willing to commit to the inverse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tony, you got any thoughts? I feel like you've been pensive and
I think
thoughtful, formulating your.
I think it's necessary to look at like Tom's reference to capitalism, but at least to the historical materials about how people get the privilege or the benefits that they get, right? Like when Hunter talks about the Royal Proclamation of 1763, those rules and those new frameworks were handed down to certain groups of people who were able to honor the parts that were useful to them and to not honor the parts that weren't. And the way that power streams in that particular way streams towards certain people, right? So I think
Let's pause. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, because we haven't talked about it before on the show.
Sorry.
We're waiting for the Truth and Reconciliation
So sorry.
episode. It's okay. What it was this thing in 1763, which you'll recall was also the year that the 7 Years' War ended and that France gave Quebec to Britain. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 is like a set of rules for how the British government's supposed to negotiate with the indigenous people. And basically it drew a line of the territory that already existed, which was like very much to the east of the current western border of Ontario. So this is like, it just sectioned off most of what's now Canada and said, you can't settle anywhere to the west of this line, and you can only do it if the only way you can get more territory from the indigenous people is to ask them specifically to a meeting that they know in advance is to negotiate new settlement and land agreements. And there's all these like protocols for how to negotiate, and then in the coming century almost none of them were ever followed when indigenous land was taken, basically. So every treaty that was negotiated for the most part violated the British government's own rules for how they were supposed to do it, which is kind of the basis of why these treaties are sometimes are considered to be not legitimate, and why so much of Canada is considered to be quote unquote unceded land. It's like not legally followed through. That's what it is. Sorry. Okay.
So yeah, based off that exact
Anthony.
idea, if you take into consideration even for a second that like everything west of wherever it was, about Kenora or something like that, I think, if you take into account
Yeah.
that land is unceded land, then every benefit the people of Manitoba and Saskatchewan and British Columbia and Alberta and the North have is still this like streamed privilege from basically the direct time that they first started saying they were going to negotiate and then never negotiating, or as I think some people say, consultation without consent, right? Like pointless consultation, and then just raw power grabs and stripping people of their land, of their culture, of their agency. So yeah, I think the people of Western Canada especially, but all of Canada, have to recognize that every piece of land you stand on was like the territory of someone else at some other point, right? And yeah, I think that's part of the national heritage.
Well, and like the only reason any of our ancestors and families had the opportunities that they had is because those opportunities were taken from other people. Like the resources, the space that they occupied was taken from other people who were there first and given to our ancestors. And that's like a heavy burden to start to put your mind against, but it is our burden. It's nobody's but ours, right? And I think that a lot of people... Oh, sorry. I think the snowball is rolling on this conversation. Like this was the conversation I was seeing, and this conversation defined Canada 150 completely. I think now it's still a lot of words and not a lot of action, especially from sexy denim Trudeau. But I have hope that we're shifting the Overton window right now. We're shifting the way that this conversation happens in the mainstream world, and hopefully that leads to people's attitudes changing over time, and then hopefully we can finally start to make Indigenous people at last feel like they are the sovereign peoples that they were always supposed to be, and we're not just on the raw end of like the most fucked up deal in history.
Yeah, I think it's that question of blame is a really interesting one. I feel like most of the reasons why a lot of atrocities happened is because, and a lot of systems of oppression, specifically colonialism, it happened because people couldn't see it. And over time, I feel like colonialism, and a lot of scholars talk about this, has shapeshifted and changed its form so that it couldn't be seen and that it couldn't, clearly be identified. So the question, to go back to what Jamie was talking about, there was a clear bad guy with Hitler, and there were clear good guys like, my family members who went off to go fight Hitler. That's a bit harder when we're talking about more complex issues of like neoliberal financialization, when we're talking about building infrastructure and starting to see how everything that we're making to continue this way of living in a very neoliberal and Western consumerism mode of living, that is kind of the major problem right now. And we're really having trouble identifying that because we are directly benefiting off of it. And at the same time, we're trying to avoid any hand in any form of obvious colonization. So there's a lot of fear. My mind goes to that scene in Lord of the Rings where
So do all.
right. but the thing is that when Frodo, when the ring's being handed over to someone, it's described as being really heavy, and there's a real tendency to interpret that scene as the ring itself is heavy, but in fact the ring is heavy only because there's a reluctancy to give it away and to relinquish that power, because the ring isn't itself evil, but it taps into the parts of you that can succumb to that. And I think that's a really important way to look at where we are now, is we have tendencies to want to avoid getting in trouble. We want to make things as easy as we can. That's just our, go-to default. We don't want to spend extra energy on anything, but just being aware of that, I feel like is a really big perspective change. And that obligation that we have, like, we're all treaty people. We all have obligations under the treaties, under the negotiations that were agreed upon at the signing of the treaties and leading up to the treaties, to follow through, to make Canada, what it was always meant to be, which was like a really dope place where you could have really great friends and you could all have enough to eat and like hang out and stuff like that. That was a future that was envisioned by both of our ancestors, and we have an obligation to uphold that, not in a strict sense, but in the sense that, hey, we should probably make things as rad as we can for as long as we can, because that would be a great thing for everyone. So like, that's all we're trying to, that's what I feel like the direction that we should be going in, because that sounds nice to me.
You know what's really ironic is that about 1,500 years from now, people are going to be colonized and go to war over what the true power of the One Ring is.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. What do you mean you think Saruman was the prophet? How dare you? Wormtongue was always the prophet.
Yeah, it's gonna be like a Sunni Shia divide between like Saruman and Sauron. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess I'm at fear of answering my own question. I use question in heavy air quotes. But I was thinking about this actually after the episode we did, Hunter, on the Standing Rock. Was the thing that resonated the most with me in that episode was the idea of a different realism, the idea of a different way of looking at how the world works and it being a functional thing, which seems so elementary to just say out loud, but and I remember talking with you guys afterwards about how Japan was this isolated island for hundreds of years, like hadn't seen mainland people in hundreds of years, and then all of a sudden, when it was when they met up again with everybody else, they were quite a bit behind technologically because they'd been isolated so long. But then, obviously, they embraced this new technology and their industry skyrocketed, and they became the technologically advanced country that they are. They became this beautiful, and they did it their way. They did it still with their Japanese values and still with their Japanese ways of doing things. But and we entered into a new branch of technological history because of this sort of time delay on this island. And I was thinking the same thing after we talked about the Standing Rock thing of like, had the colonizers come and honored the treaties and given better deals and perhaps made a better way to share the land, or whatever the deal was, to think of the people that the First Nations North Americans could have been, had all of that been honored, is the sad part. And that's the what's really sad is it was happening. It did happen. Certainly, as they were being destroyed and colonized, there was technological interchange, and First Nations people were rapidly adapting their art styles, their agriculture, their everything, and it was changing quite rapidly, and they were embracing new technologies and incorporating those new technologies. But that process, they didn't have the benefit of Japan of being isolated and numerous and concentrated. Maybe if all of the Indigenous people in Canada had lived in a very, very clear territory that offered them security, like physical security, like an island, that we would be having a very different story right now. There's many. It's kind of a Western-centric way to think of it, I think, but certainly you can see the evolution of Indigenous art through the 19th century as different Western tools come into their hands. They started, making their culture with these new tools. The culture was changing. I don't know.
But likewise, the same thing happened in the reverse too. I mean, the amount of affectation that indigeneity had on European and Western modes of thought, governance, the economy. You really, like, one of the dangers when we're talking about this is this concept of European diffusionism, where all change radiates from Europe. I mean, like the U.S. Constitution was based off the Iroquois Great Law of Peace.
Right.
The
Marx
whole
socialism was also based off of indigenous, like as you said, Marx's theory of communism was based off of indigenous economic systems and principles of sharing and shared resources, right?
And the massive wealth that came to Europe around the 1500s, which led to like a lot of the foundational pillars of Western society came from illegal dispossession of indigenous lands, theft, like complete like ravaging of the landscape for like silver and gold.
Well, and the literal survival of the human coming from Europe to North America depended completely on the indigenous people, not just for knowledge of like what shit to eat and what shit not to eat, but even stuff as specific as like when Vancouver burned to the ground in 1895, I think, right at the beginning of the century, maybe it was 1905, at the beginning of the 20th century, it was the indigenous people who like took people into their homes and like literally saved hundreds of people from the fire and stuff. And then those people had all their shit taken and were destroyed by the people they had saved. You know, it's like one huge chain of crazy injustices.
And it's just really interesting to frame it in like a lot of the stuff that we're doing now, you know, and that we have now has direct connection to indigenous cultures. Like to be real right now, tomatoes come from the Americas. Potatoes come from the Americas. Vanilla, you know, there are so many things that we have completely divorced from its original.
Trap music was an Iroquois thing. Fucking the Tesla.
Yeah, the Tesla. Spoons.
Yeah. Tidal music.
Yeah. Reggae. Anyway. Yeah, but you know, I think there's another thing that we need to be aware of, and it's another tricky thing that's very difficult to catch ourselves on, is when we start internalizing the inherent correctness of progress and a linear definition of us progressing. Is a very tricky one, because it can let people get off the hook very easily. Like, we don't go from smarter to dumber. It's more complex. It's more circuitous.
Like, is our culture better because my fucking bidet has Wi-Fi? Or, like, is your culture better because you exist in a harmony where you're using your resources in a way that is sustainable literally forever? You know, like, like those are two very different views of what a society's values are, but is one better than the other?
Yeah, and like I feel like, you know, we can use technology as tools, but we also have to be aware of technology isn't just like a laptop or like a really fancy bidet. Yeah. It's also how we organize and communicate ideas, people, and the environment. So
yeah, and that's what I was sort of trying to clumsily talk about when I was talking about the new versions of realism. That the ways of thinking about the world.
Yeah, cool, good combo, guys.
Yo.
I feel like we should probably wrap it up. I mean, I'm glad we got to kind of like pull this conversation apart though, and chat about it and stuff, because it's the conversation that's happening right now.
Yeah, actually, I do have another question, and this will be a nice last question. And it's sort of the classic like moving forward thing, because what is I mean, I was really looking forward to this 150. For the reason of the discourse it was going to create, because I figure, as I said before, as history moves forward, with events in the history are never more relevant than they are right now. You know what I mean? Like, they're consistently getting less and less relevant, and as we get further and further away from it, I feel like it's harder and harder to make arguments for change. Like, you know, you think of like, is anybody pissed at the fall of Rome like anymore? No, nobody is, and because it's so far away. But in the time and for hundreds of years after, it was like an immensely troublesome thing. And I worry that as we get further and further away from Confederation, that it becomes less that becomes less on the tip of people's brains, I guess. And so that's why I was excited. And so now I wonder, moving forward, and also I will say again, I understand that it's not like the last horrible thing that happened to the indigenous people happened 150 years ago. I understand that it continued to happen and is continuing to happen in a different way, but is continuing to happen. So moving forward, what are you guys thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're in any danger of having this conversation recede into the background anytime soon. I see a huge sense of responsibility from Indigenous people from all walks of life, from all nations in Canada, and I think I see a real energy among them to pick this torch up and carry it into the 21st century blazing really strong. So I think that our responsibility as settlers is to prime ourselves with information, is to get informed and approach the conversations that those nations want to have as informed and empathetically and intelligently as possible. I think literally just the step of truly learning the scope and scale of Canada's genocide of the Indigenous peoples is it will change your perspective on it. It will become very hard, I think, to continue to be why do they still care about this? Why don't they just get over it? Like, you will understand very quickly why they are not over it, heavy air quotes, if you start to take in the facts. I think that simply learning the true story, and not just like the kind of like the buzzwords about it, but like learning the actual things that happened and why they happened, especially because what's really the stake in the heart of the myth of Canada being a nice place is like how deeply racist the people who formed our country were. And so I think as settlers we need to just get informed, listen, and walk into the next 150 years, hopefully, of our country, ready to have this conversation on a really well-constructed bed of facts.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would like to see carried forward is to challenge the ideas. And this isn't like through like you gotta go and like get another degree or something like that. This is like really just allow yourself to ask the question like, okay, do I actually believe that there isn't enough resources to go around? Do I believe that there is only room for one person to be right? And really challenge these assumptions that we have of scarcity that are being circulated around through media, through misinformation. I think something that would be really dope is if people were to be like, there is enough room for me as a person. There is enough, time right now, and having this abundance mindset rather than a scarcity mindset when it comes to solving these issues. Because a lot of the times people think that, well, if we give this minority group more rights, then it's going to take away from me. If we really limit ourselves to that belief, I feel like that's a cause of a lot of problems. So what I would argue is like, well, let's look at it with an abundance mindset. What if there were enough things to go around? What if, and how do we get there? I think that's an important thing, and I think that concept was laid out and used by the ancestors of this country, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. They saw that, and that's what they were hopefully going for. And I think that if we have a resurgence of those older ways of looking at the world and relating to our human and non-human relations, I think we'll see a very interesting Canada in like 150 years.
Amazing.
Boys?
My Google Hangouts crashed, so I actually missed the question.
The question was like, what's next? What do you see going forward from the Grand Canada 150? What's your hope? What's your dream? What's your fear?
Yeah, I would say, like, hopping off what Hunter said, I think one thing, and sort of tying back to something that Richard had said earlier in the conversation, is that to me it's about narrative and it's about the way that we understand the world, and that like so long as there is a power, like I know a lot of people where I grew up believed pretty firmly that Indigenous folks got a bunch of like insane amounts of money from the government to deal with it, to do their lives, and to like all of these sort of freebies that they got, or like that. And so because they believe this, it's really easy for them to say like, oh well, if they're not able to succeed in society, there's something wrong with them because they're actually given more to start off with than I am, and I managed to make something of myself and they didn't. And so and to me it's like once we understand these things correctly, I'm curious what like the American understanding of their relationship with Indigenous folks is, because like I think that Canada sees itself as the nice guy on the block, and that like a real reckoning with our history sort of destroys that idea a little bit, which then I think will allow for like a rearrangement of priorities and a rearrangement of understanding of what we need to do once we sort of can see ourselves differently.
Like, my understanding from a distance is that all the same ideas and struggles and injustices and problems exist with the Indigenous community in America that exist in Canada, but there's just comparatively less mental space and resources for it in the country's discourse because of the presence of the slavery question.
But I'd also say that like is there, because it was a lot more sort of, the colonization was a lot more bald in the States, like they had a lot more people calling, like a lot more people that they celebrate today calling for genocide and calling for these things. And is it like do people,
a termination policy? Yeah.
Do people not know about Andrew Jackson in the way that we don't, like Andrew Jackson's Trail of Tears in the way that we don't know about like John A. Macdonald's plan to, you know, kill the Indian to save the child? Or is there, like, I don't know. To me, I think there's something a little bit more honest, you know, not better, but more honest. If you're like, yeah, we went in there with guns and we killed them, and we killed them because we wanted their land. Then you can sort of like have that truth as a part of your national myth, where you're like, yeah, this is what we wanted and we did it. The end. Whereas with the Canadian perspective of it being like, oh, we made a bunch of deals and we gave them these things and we still give them these things and that's why it's not a problem and that's why it's their fault and not our fault. Like if you like to have a real honest idea of how things happen, then at least you can build off of that. You can build truth from that. That truth might be violent and terrible, but at least you're building from truth. And so that's what I want for the next 150 years.
I was talking to a friend of mine recently about Jian Ghomeshi, because he's announced recently that he's starting his new podcast, right?
Until that guy fucking announces that he's being fired out of the cannon with his son, I will not be happy.
Exactly, and here's the point I was sort of making is I'm not to speculate too much, but like I feel like, you know, when Jian Ghomeshi's podcast comes out, I feel like it's going to be universally hated, but if when all these allegations were coming out and when all these women were coming forward with all these stories, if he instead stood up and said, everything they're saying is true, I have a serious problem, they are outlining some of the most regrettable moments in my life, I will make any reparations that they feel are necessary, I want to seek help for myself, if that means going to jail, then I'll go to jail, if it means going to see a therapist every day for the next 15 years, I'll do that, I want to make this right. And then 15 years from now, he came out with a podcast that said, this is who I am now and this is the journey I've taken. I would be interested in listening to a couple episodes, because that shows to me like a growth in character and understanding of his problem. But because he denied, got off, and then and is now like, okay, start over, start from where I left off. Everybody's like, but you didn't grow at all. You didn't learn anything. You got away with something. At the very least, you got away with something. And And I kind of see the same, and as exemplified by Germany, and I sort of see the same thing for Canada. Is that like if there's a little less dragging of the feet, and as Thomas said, if just responsibility was taken, we could take that mistake could become part of our cultural identity, and we could wear it as a reminder and use it to build character from. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that I think this is the real nation building in Canada will be how we move forward with this question. Like this will be a thing that we all have in common. Is we all have to take on this piece of responsibility. Tony, you got anything?
I think we have maybe on a slightly lighter note, like there is some light on the horizon, because if you look back at the 100th anniversary of Confederation, that like we'd just gotten a flag, and a lot of Canadians felt they'd defined themselves through the war, and the Quebecois people just had their quiet revolution, and so it was a big time of celebration to consider what the country could mean for the next 50 or 100 years or whatever. And that's when multiculturalism came in as an official idea, and that's when Trudeau started crafting kind of the Great Society that a lot of settler Canadians think of as the dream of Canada. And now at the 150th, we've institutionalized this idea of multiculturalism, and we've confused it with the Truth and Reconciliation report, right? And so that is kind of one of the bedrocks of the next 150 years, I think, and that's always going to be part of our new national consciousness. It's this society that was so great for these settler people, and then so great for these Quebecois people, and then this idea that we could extend that to everyone, and now we're finally taking the idea that we have to extend it to the people whose land we had savaged for 150 years, and 150, 200, 300 years beyond in the past, beyond that, right? So
we could all make it to 200. We could all live to see. It's within our life expectancy for us to see Canada turn 200, and I do honestly and truly hope that we're able to look back and say, hey, remember this conversation? Well, look how far we've come. I think that actually could be the great work of our lives. We'll be very, a lot close to the end of our lives when Canada turns 200, but if you want to think of what we can achieve in the next 50 years, I really do hope we look back and say, hey, we tried and we made some progress.
Yeah.
That'd be very nice.
Of course, then people are going to be like, you recorded a what? A podcast?
Yeah. Oh, Grandpa, I'm listening to the central tree brain.
Yeah.
I was going to say
that I'm plugged into through this avatar route.
this might be a hand grenade, so you can feel free to just cut this whole section out if we don't want to have this conversation. But my dream for 50 years from now is there isn't a country because there aren't countries. Because that's what I don't know. That's what over and above what
okay, John Lennon.
over and above what the problems with Canada. I have problems with just the idea of nations, and to me, growing up in Alberta, it was such a looking back at it now, it's such a clear to me example of mindless imperialism, because oil wasn't a thing back then, and growing up in Alberta, it's a savage place. It gets so cold, and it's just it could be a terrible place to live, and yet we claimed it because we could. It was just empty. It was just there was just land there, so we took it, and we're like, this is ours now. We'd be like, yeah, but it's terrible. They'd be like, yeah, but it's ours. It's our terrible land. And so it's just the idea that we built this country, vast stretches of which are just pretty antithetical to human existence, is insane to me. And so the fact that we the idea of nations is insane, and the idea of nations was something that was come up with within our lifetimes. We will be. I think within our children's lifetimes, they will be farther away from. No, never mind. The idea of nations is pretty young. The idea of nations really came in with Napoleon. When he was just this is a country, Germany is a country, Italy is a country, France is a country. The idea of nations like that. Before that, it was just this is the area that I control. This is the area, and bound together by languages or bound together by other concepts. But the idea of a nation is a pretty young idea. And I'm wondering whether in 50 years' time we will have moved past this idea of arbitrary invisible lines on a map being some sort of important unifying idea. But it's just
yeah, we'll all just be Google.
Right?
That's what it'll be. We'll all fucking be owned by Google.
Yeah, I am Google Unit 1A7*256.
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting point because I just recently sat down with like one of the smartest scholars I know in indigenous feminisms, technosciences, and the environment.
Plug your podcast.
Oh, yo, I'm doing a podcast. I hope it works when I launch it. But it's called the Urban Indigenous Survival Guide: Thriving in the Post-Apocalypse. And what do is we collide with a lot of Canada's leaders, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who are thinking rad things, doing great things, and really asking important questions to equip us as Canadians with the tools that we need to not only survive this post-apocalyptic world that we're in right now, but also thrive in a good and meaningful way. So I sat down with someone by the name of Dr. Kim Tallbear, and we were talking about this concept of progress, moving forward, what that meant, things that we could do. And she was saying that she really encourages people to, start moving away from this idea of the nation state. And I found that to be very interesting, an idea that kind of tags into what you're talking about, Thomas, about really understanding what narratives we're really holding on to, maybe a little bit more tightly than we actually need to. So the nation state idea, a scarcity mindset idea, capitalism.
And I think that scarcity...
I'm really curious to see
I think scarcity and the nation state are tied together. Is that it's like the idea that like we don't have enough, so we have to make sure there's a clear delineation. There isn't enough, so we have to make a clear delineation of this is ours.
It's ours.
So that we have so we can make sure that we have enough because we have this stuff and it's definitely ours. Whereas if we're moving past the idea of scarcity, then we can move into like, oh, actually we don't need to have this like arbitrary line drawn along the 49th parallel because like it's just a matter of who has what and where it needs to go.
Yeah. Sweet boys, I have to wrap us up here because I have to take off soon to go perform in my pretend play. Thanks to all of you for coming on.
Yes.
And riff-raffing about Canada 150 with us. And thanks for everyone for listening to our first remote recording experiment.
Yeah, there's going to be a few more of these before we're all back in the same room again. So enjoy.
Strap in, but we'll be back with kind of more normal programming episodes next week.
Yes.
So in the meantime, if you like what you hear, share the episode around, tell your friends about us. You can find us on Twitter at @ExplainJamie or find us Explain to Jamie wherever the internet leads you. Just Google it. We're there.
Yes.
Get in touch with us if you have ideas for topics, things you want to talk about, questions, concerns,
comments,
clarifications.
If you have something that you would have loved to have said, were you a part of this sweet Google Hangout? Please send it along. We would love to address it later on. As always, be vigilant. Have these conversations in your regular life. I can't say enough how, just putting my ignorance on the table to be analyzed by my super smart friends has it benefited my life, and so I encourage you to also do that in your lives. You don't need to be broadcasting your learning experience just to learn. So be vigilant and be curious and stay in conversation.
Right. Thanks everybody.
Until next time, I'm Jamie.
I'm Richard.
I'm Hunter.
I'm
I'm
Thomas.
Anthony.
Brutal. See you next time. Woo!